In this section, guys, we're going to be diving into data structures, and we're going to be covering something called arrays. So let's go ahead and get started with what they are. All right, guys, so what exactly is an array? So it's an ordered list that stores values of the same type. So think of it as a collection or list or like a grouping of data, right? And we use lists in our everyday life all the time, like when you make a to-do list or a grocery store list, or you use a shopping cart when you're checking out online. These are all examples of arrays, and we're just going to go through some of these examples to talk more about what they are and what their functionalities are and how we're going to be using them. So first up, we have this shopping cart, guys. So think of the shopping cart as your array. It's like a structure that's going to hold a bunch of items that you're about to buy, right? And some of the actions that you can perform on that structure might be what? You might be able to add things to your shopping cart or remove things from that shopping cart or apply a discount to a certain item in your shopping cart. And then you might want to get the total of all the items in your shopping cart before you check out, right? So here, the shopping cart is like the array. It's the structure in which we store all of that data. Next up, something very similar, we might have like an expenses list or program that keeps track of all of our daily expenses. And some of the functionality associated with that's pretty similar to the shopping cart. You might want to see the total of all your expenses for that month. So think of that expenses list as the array here. And then, lastly, we have like a to-do list. So think of the to-do list as your array where you store a bunch of items that you have to do for like that day, essentially. And you can check items off that list or add items to that list, remove them from the list, so on and so forth. So that's what arrays are going to be in programs and applications. And I want us to now go over how exactly that's going to look in the code before we jump into it. And below we see a couple different examples of what arrays or lists, same thing, might look like in real life applications and programs. So first up, we have a shopping cart, right? This might just contain a list of items that you want to buy. We use an array to create that list of items that we can ultimately update as we go, right? We can add things to it or remove things from it, and then ultimately like check out at the end, and it'll give us like a total of the cost of all the items that we want to buy. Next up is like an array of expenses or a list of expenses, right? Once again, you might want to see the total of your expenses for that month. Or you might want to look at the most expensive item in that expenses array, the cheapest item, so on and so forth. We use arrays to create that list and add things to it and perform actions on it, like getting the total and things like that. And then next up, we have something like a to-do list, right? This is something that we can, create a list of items of things we have to do. We can update that list by saying, hey, this thing is done, or, update the due date for this item, add something to the list, remove something from the list, so on and so forth. So these are all real life examples of what we might use arrays for in real life programs. So next up, let's go ahead and take a look at what it looks like to create arrays. So first up, we see we can create an array by initializing it with values. Each item in that array is separated by a comma, creating an ordered list. And we can also create blank arrays and modify them later. So here's what that's going to look like in the code. Okay, so you guys can see here that we're creating these things as variables, and then we name it very similar to what we did in our variables and constants video. And we're going to use these square brackets to create an array. And we'll come back to this example in a little bit. I want to hop into these shopping cart and expenses examples. So here we have a shopping cart, and we're giving it these square brackets, and we're populating that list with these items. And as you guys can see here, each item is separated by a comma. That's how your computer knows where one list item is versus the next, right? So in a list, you obviously want to be able to tell where things are, and we have to separate each list item with a comma. So this is a particular array of strings, right? And we are giving this array values to start off with, or initializing it with values, as we see in our first point here. Same thing with our expenses array. We're initializing it with numbers. Here we're initializing this with strings. And an important point to note here, guys, is that arrays cannot mix data types. So you can't have a mix of strings and numbers in one array. So that brings me to my next point with this to-do list guy. So when would we want to create a blank array? And why is this like have string in it? And what are these parentheses and all that stuff? So let's go over that now before we hop into the code. So if you think about going to an online shopping site with a shopping cart, does that shopping cart start off with things inside of it? No, right? It starts off as empty, and then you add things to it or remove things from it. So that's an example of when you might want to create a blank array. The only thing we have to do when we create a blank array is supply it with the data type that it's going to be populated with. So we're saying that, hey, this to-do list guy has to be an array of strings. So that's just an example of when you would want to create a blank array. And once again, we use these square brackets and we just put string inside of it, which is the data type. And then these constructors here, these parentheses, don't worry about that too much. That essentially just creates that blank array for us, but we'll go over that in the code. So just a quick wrap up of these 3 points, guys. We can create an array by initializing it with values, like we see here with the shopping cart and expenses. Each item separated by a comma, creating an ordered list. And we can also create blank arrays and modify them later, which is what we see in this to-do list item. So now that we've done that, let's just go and hop into the code and create some arrays before we move on to some of the more fancy stuff with like how to modify and update our arrays and perform actions on them and stuff like that. So let's go ahead and open Xcode back up, guys, and let's go ahead and create another playground for our arrays module here. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Command N, and we're going to search for a blank file once again, hit next, and we're going to call this arrays. Okay, so let's just go ahead and start off by creating some arrays here, and let's create our mark really quick, creating arrays, and let's go ahead and just make a shopping cart guy. And we're going to initialize this as a blank array. So this is what it should look like, guys. So once again, you just state that this is going to be a variable. Why does it need to be a variable? Well, ultimately, we're going to want to modify this at some point, right? We're going to want to add things to it or remove things from it. And if it's a constant, you can't do that. Here's where we name it, and then we open up a square bracket, say that it's going to be populated with strings. And once again, these two parentheses actually create the thing for us. I know that might be confusing right now. Don't really worry about that. But if you were to remove that, your program would throw an error, okay? And it said it's expected member name or constructor call, which is what we're looking for there. So this indicates to our compiler to actually create that thing. And like I said, if that's confusing, don't worry. Next up, let's create another array for something like names. Here, let's do some F1 drivers. Let's say like Lewis Hamilton. And then we're going to put a comma, and make sure you put the comma after the quotes, okay? And then I like to do a space, and then we can say Charles Leclerc, or Leclerc, however the hell you say that guy's name. And then let's maybe do like Max Verstappen as well. Don't judge me on who I like in F1. We're not here to talk about that. But let's talk about the differences between these two things. So why do we not need the parentheses here, right? Well, that's because we're supplying this array with values to start off with, or we are initializing it with values. So if you don't give an array values to start with, then you have to apply this constructor. If you do give the array values to start off with, like we're doing here, then you don't have to do that. So basically, guys, these are both arrays of strings, but in this example, we are initializing it with data. Okay, and then let's make one more for something like prices. And then we can just say equals like 24, 12, 35, and like $500 or something, right? So this is just an array of numbers, and it denotes like prices of potential items that we want to buy or something, okay? So next up, guys, this is pretty straightforward. I want us to go over how we can actually like modify our arrays and access individual items in my array. So for example, what do I mean by access? Well, let's say I wanted to grab the first item in my array and say, hey, Lewis Hamilton drives for Mercedes. And then let's say I wanted to look at the second item and say, hey, Charles Leclerc drives for Ferrari, even though that might switch soon, I heard, but irrelevant. And then Max Verstappen is the last item in the array, and we want to say he drives for Red Bull. Or what if I want to remove one of these drivers from here? Or what if I want to add another driver? That's what we're going to go over how to do next. So I want to give you guys a visual representation of what this stuff is going to look like. First off, I want to talk about what it means to access an array item. So each value in an array is assigned an index. And if you think about it, that makes sense, right? Like in a list, you want to have an index associated with each item, meaning like, hey, this is the first item, this is the second item, the third item, fourth, and so on and so forth, so that you can access those items as you go. In programming, this is something that throws a lot of people off at first, but the index or the counting always begins at 0. So the first item in the array has an index of 0. The second item has an index of 1. The third item has an index of 2. Why exactly they do that, I'm not sure, but that's how almost every single programming language is. Indexing or counting always begins at 0. So if I want to access the first item in my array, I would go and look at the 0 index. The second item, I would look at the 1 index. The third item, I would look at the 2 index. So that's how we access array items, guys. Next up, we have modifying arrays. So we can add or remove items from them. And that's what this is going to look like. So if we append something, it adds it to a list. And then if we remove something, it will remove it from that list. So I'm going to show you that one more time. This right here represents what it's going to look like in the code, and this is going to be a visual representation of the array. So let's go ahead and see this one more time. So if we have this array to start, right, just MacBook Pro and AirPods Pro, and then we execute this command, shoppingcart.append GoPro, it's going to add an item to my list, just like that. And then if I have that same array and I call shoppingcart.remove at 2, right? It's going to say, hey, I'm going to remove the item at index 2, and then it will just remove that guy like so. So this is what we're going to be doing in the code next, guys. We're going to go over how to access items in the array and how to modify our arrays. So really quick, let's hop back into Xcode and let's go ahead and create another section. And we're going to say access and modification here. And the first thing I want us to do, guys, is go ahead and see if we can add an item to our shopping cart. So let's just go ahead. Oops, my bad. Let's go ahead and say shopping cart.append. And you guys will see that that comes up in our autocomplete window and it says adds a new element at the end of the array. So this adds an item to the very end of the list. We're going to go over how to add something at the beginning of the list or anywhere in the list that we want in just a little bit. So here, you guys notice that it says, give me a new element, and that it has to be a string because it recognizes that when we created it, we said that this has to be an array of strings. So here, we can just go and say MacBook Pro. And let's go ahead and just hit play right there and pay attention to what's happening over here, guys. So you guys notice that up here, my shopping cart has 0 elements. My names guy has 3 elements. My prices guy has 4. And now shopping cart has 1 element inside of it, and it's MacBook Pro. Okay. So then we can also say, like, if we want to add another item to it, shopping cart.append AirPods Pro. Hit play. And now it has 2 elements, and you see that it added that item to the very end of the list there, right? Okay. So next up, let's go over how to access items inside of our arrays. And then we'll go over some of the other modification operations like removing and inserting and stuff like that. So like I said, guys, imagine I wanted to get a certain item, like individual item from this array. How do we do that? So I could say, let like driver1 equal names, and then open up my square bracket and then pass in 0, okay? So this is how we access something. So basically we're saying we're going to store this thing in a property, and I want you to give me back what is at the 0 index in the names array. So this should give me back Lewis Hamilton. Let's go ahead and run this, and we see here that it gives me back Lewis Hamilton. Then I could say let driver2 equal names 1, and as you guys might be able to guess, this is going to give me back Charles Leclerc. Charles Leclerc. And then if I want to get driver 3, you guys should be able to get this by now. We would say names 2. So this is accessing individual items in our array, guys. We just state the array name here, and then we open up our square brackets and we pass in an index. However, if you were to try to say like driver 4 equal names 3, your program would crash, unfortunately, because there is no fourth item or item at 3 in the third index or 3 index in my array. So we have to be careful with how we access items in our arrays, and there's much safer ways of doing this, and we will see that later on as we go. So make sure that you don't get this error here. Let's go ahead and delete that. And once again, guys, that was happening because that item doesn't exist. There's only 3 items inside of this array. So trying to get names 3 would say, hey, get me the 4th item, but there is no 4th item, so our program crashes. Okay, so actually let's keep that there and comment it out by just hitting Command/ and say, this will cause crash, index out of bounds. So that's what the crash would say. The index you've given me is out of bounds. So next up, let's go over how we can remove some items from our array. So let's say like names.remove at 2. So you guys will notice that this guy is saying, hey, you have to give me an index that you want me to remove the thing from. Okay, so if I hit play here, you guys will notice that this gives me back Max Verstappen because that's the thing that it removed. But if I were to go ahead here and just say names or print names, whatever you want to do, it now only has 2 elements inside of it, okay? Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc. So let's go ahead and see if we can do that with our prices as well. We could say like prices.remove at 1. And that would give me back 12. But if I go ahead and just type prices out, we can see the updated list. So the reason that's giving me back 12 is because that's what it removed. But now it only has 3 elements inside of it. And it's 24, 35, and 500. Okay, next up, guys, let's go over how we can insert items at anywhere we want to in the array, right? Because if you think about it, what if you want to add something to an array, but you want to add it at a certain spot, right? Like you want to add it in the first spot, or you want to add it somewhere in the middle. Append is only going to add something to the end. So there is another operation we can perform to add something anywhere we want to in the array. So here I could say like names.insert, and it's going to give me 2 items that I have to pass in to this function here, or this operation. It's going to say inserts a new element at the specified position. So basically this function or this operation here is saying, hey, what's the item you want to add and where do you want to add it? So here I could say like, Checo Perez, another F1 driver, and then I want to add him at 0. This is going to add Checo at the first index. So inserts item at beginning of array. And let's just go ahead and run this, guys. Okay, so now you'll notice my array is Checo Perez, Lewis Hamilton, and Charles Leclerc. And Max Verstappen is still gone because we removed him here. So let me add another comment, removes item at specified index. Okay, and then, that works the same way if you want to insert, like an item anywhere in the array. So you could insert it at the 1 index, the 2 index. The only requirement is the index remain in bounds, okay? And if you want to just add it to the end, then you use append. So let's add another note there. Adds item at end of list. Perfect. And then we have some other commands, guys. Like we could say prices.remove first. And that will just remove the first item in the array. And you can also say prices.remove last. And that will remove the last item in the array. So these are all just pretty basic examples of operations that we can perform on our arrays. And they should all make sense, right? These are things we do in real life programs and applications every day. When we remove things from a list, or we add things to a list, or we say, hey, get me this item and maybe perform a discount code on it, or go in my to-do list, look at item 3 and check that off my list, right? So this is how we accomplish those simple operations and perform operations on lists of data in our programs. So next up, guys, I want us to talk about another type of data structure. It's going to be a dictionary, and it's going to have certain capabilities that arrays do not, but they're going to be pretty much the same just different. Same, but different, if you know what I mean. So let's go ahead and take a look at what dictionaries are going to look like, and then that's going to wrap it up for our data structures fundamentals. So we'll see you guys there.